Hello, I'm Mark Tony. I serve as chair of the State Bar Board of Trustees Audit Committee and happy to welcome you to the April 23, 2026 meeting of the Audit Committee. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. And so I want to go ahead and ask our audit committee coordinator, Angela Marlowe, to take the roll.
Buenaventura,
Present.
Harrison,
Present.
Huser, Stevens,
Present.
Tony.
Present.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. I want to thank all my colleagues and staff for joining the meeting. I want to thank everybody who is joining remotely. Welcome to the meeting. First item we have is the call for public comment. And this is one of my favorite parts of any meeting because we get to listen to what members of the public want us to hear about. And so, in general, we encourage you to keep these comments within the jurisdiction of what the state bar handles. And can you tell me, Angela, what we have for people that are pre-signed up or perhaps have their hands raised? Where are we at on this?
Chair Tony, we don't have any advanced signups. If there's anyone who would like to give a public comment right now, you can use the raise hand function so that we can account for you, please. I don't see any raised hands either.
Okay. Well, in that case, we've, provided opportunity for public comment. Seeing no one asking for public comment, I will close public comment. And if we could note that Trustee Huser has joined. We have a full house today. Thank you very much, everybody. Do appreciate it. So I think we can go right into the agenda. The first item is always the chair's oral report. We got two big items to talk about today. One is the generative AI governance and oversight, and the other is to talk about our cybersecurity audit and review. That one will be in closed session. And I'll get into the reasons for that later. But what I'll say for now is that there are other items that the audit committee has on its plate that we will address not at this meeting, but at future meetings. We have our annual audit that we're going to be looking at the meeting in May. There's also a state audit that we're waiting for that is an audit on the February 25 bar exam. And there are other audits out in the world. But today, and those will be in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and our next item is the minutes, approval of the February 19th, 2026 open session minutes. And first I want to ask, are there any corrections or modifications that anybody would like to request? Yes, please, Trustee Stevens.
The minutes indicate that Trustee Buenaventura was absent, but he voted to approve the minutes in the first item.
Well, that's a pretty cool trick. Thank you very much, Trustee Stevens, for noting that. I would presume that we could amend the minutes to simply reflect Trustee Buenaventura's presence. Does that sound right to everyone? So with that amendment, do I hear a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll make the motion.
Okay.
There's a second correction. Sorry.
Second, oh, please
Okay.
do, and thank you, Trustee Stevens.
Down in the lower part, it indicates that Trustee Buenaventura is absent with respect to one of the line item votes.
And that sounds like amendment that we should also be taking up in this motion. Um, Trustee Stevens, are there any more? Okay, thank you very much. I so much appreciate. These are minutes that I did not have time to review myself. Just being clear about that, and I appreciate Trustee Stevens you taking the time. And Trustee Harrison, is it safe to assume that your motion incorporates the two amendments?
Yes, it does.
Okay, and in that case, am I assuming that Trustee Stevens, that you are seconding?
Second.
Okay, we got a motion, we got a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, I would ask for a roll call vote, please.
Buenaventura,
Aye.
Harrison,
Aye.
Huser,
Aye.
Stevens,
Aye.
Tony.
Aye.
5 ayes, 0 nays. The minutes are adopted.
Thank you very much. So the first item on our agenda, business agenda today, is the item 3.1, the Generative AI Governance and Oversight Update. And I believe we have Principal Program Analyst Helen Peterson to guide us through. Does that sound right?
Hi, everybody. Yes, I am here. It's nice to meet you all and see some of you again. My name is Helen Peterson. I lead our Office of Digital Transformation, and I will be presenting today with an update about our generative AI governance framework. Going to get to sharing.
Thank you.
Okay, is that looking good to everybody?
Yes.
Very good.
Thank you. Let's talk about what we will cover today. We have three kind of buckets that we're looking at. The first is how we got here. So some background on where this generative AI governance framework came from and the process that it went through to be approved. Then we'll talk about where we are and how we have built upon that governance framework and looked at operationalizing it. And then third, we are going to be presenting the generative AI usage inventory for the audit committee to review. This is all of the ways that we're using AI at the organization. We have compiled that for the audit committee to review and discuss. So we'll get started with a bit of background on the Gen AI governance framework. The background of this, in 2025, the Audit Committee directed staff to develop a governance framework for how the State Bar uses generative AI. The Office of Digital Transformation, my office, presented this proposed framework in September and then October, incorporating comments and suggestions from the Audit Committee. And then we were able to bring forward that governance framework to the November 2025 meeting, where it was unanimously approved by the Board of Trustees. Since then, we have been working very hard to build around that and meet the requirements passed in that governance framework. A lot of you have seen this slide before, but really what it outlines are the three pillars of our framework. The first is, how do we evaluate and implement AI consistently so that we are checking for things like compliance, ethics, are we investing our resources wisely, and that we are doing that in a very systematic way, pretty much doing it the same way every time. So this starts with identifying the use cases that we're interested in using AI for, then going through an approval process with our generative AI review staff committee who thinks about that use case and that tool and makes decisions about, is this the correct tool? Is it the right use case? Should we be using AI for this at all? And then finally, on the implement side, This is where we are putting a lot of controls around our AI use. So really spelling out what are the reviews required, what is the tracking and data collection required for this system, and we're doing that for all the systems that we implement. The second pillar is the post-launch. So after an AI tool has been launched, how are we monitoring it for both effectiveness as well as compliance? And so that's another oversight panel that we have and that we have established. And we will be doing twice a year evaluations of all of our AI tools and providing a report with the outcomes of those evaluations to the audit committee. The third pillar is kind of what we're doing today. How are we reporting out and about our AA use and keeping the audit committee apprised of what we are doing? So again, twice a year, we'll be providing this generative AI inventory as well as those performance reports. Moving ahead, a little bit of a reminder on our committee structure. So the first one is this generative AI review staff committee. This is very approval focused. So before an AI tool is even used, it goes through this committee to talk about, should we be using AI for this purpose? What are the controls we want to put around it? So what you'll see here is this committee staff includes Office of General Counsel, our IT and cybersecurity team, and then myself kind of, manage a lot of this committee. And then the offices that are represented on this committee include OCTC, Strategic Communications, Division of Regulation, and Office of Admissions. And then the other, we're calling it the Oversight Panel. This is that monitoring focused body. Also includes the same committee staff, OGC, cybersecurity, myself. But we also have some additions in terms of the offices represented. So we have OCTC, but we also have the Office of Research and Statistics, who's providing a lot of subject matter expertise of how to collect and monitor data. We also have the Office of Compliance on this committee, as we think they bring a lens of how to, audit and check our systems. We have the Office of Access and Inclusion and State Bar Court. So what you'll see here, we really tried to bring subject matter experts from across the org and really represent the entire state bar in these committees. And I will tell you, both of these committees are stood up and have had a couple meetings at this point at minimum. This is also a very important thing to kind of recall for all of us. This is what was approved back in November in terms of our risk-based approach to AI. So we are not necessarily treating all AI systems the same. We think they fall into 3 different risk categories. The first is low risk. This would be any kind of generative AI use cases where the outputs are only internal. These are things like drafting an internal email, writing a team meeting agenda, brainstorming maybe an outline of something you're working on internally. What we need for that is my office approves the use of that use case. It goes on our generative AI inventory, so you will see all of these low risk uses that we have. And we do basic compliance verification. Medium risk is when we jump into things that are shared externally. So if we're using generative AI for anything that's going outward to the public, it falls into that medium risk category, or anything that will influence state bar operations. So when we think about that, some of that includes if we are analyzing large data sets that might influence, maybe how we do an email campaign or anything like that, that would be medium risk because the outcomes of that analysis, could impact how we do our operations at the state bar. Medium risk gets the full governance process. So starts from an intake process, goes through the AI review committee, and then after launch, if it's approved, gets monitored twice a year. And then there's the high risk approach. We do not currently have any use cases that are high risk, but there are 2 ways something can be high risk. The first is if the outputs are automatically implemented, shared, or acted upon without mandatory human review. Again, we don't have any of these use cases right now. The second one is if the use case involves a subject matter that the Board of Trustees has designated as requiring heightened oversight. So in this case, these high risks, if we were to ever pursue something, would come to the board first. So we would start with you all and then bring it to the AI review committee if we were permitted to continue to pursue that risk case. Something else I will just comment on here, when we think about things like cybersecurity and a legal review, that really happens on all of our IT systems and sits outside of this framework. But I do want you all to know that that is being done. It's just being done just as we do with all of our IT systems. And a quick point of clarification. So we are evaluating each individual use case, not just the tool. And what we mean by that, or why we are doing that, the same tool can fall into different risk levels depending on how it's being used. So a case in point is Copilot Chat, which is our primary generative AI assistant. Low risk, Copilot Chat could help you refine an upcoming internal team meeting agenda. That would be a low risk case. You're using Copilot Chat for it. Medium risk, though, Copilot Chat could help us write content for the State Bar website, and that would be a strong medium risk use case. So when things are coming to the AI review committee, we are very much pressure testing the use case and not the tool. And so what you'll see on the inventory is sometimes things will pop up in both the low risk and the medium risk. And what we're saying there is that it is approved for both use cases, but that we may govern the medium risk use cases for that tool differently than the low risk cases. So now I'm going to talk about kind of all the work that we've done since that governance framework was approved in November. So we've been building a lot of kind of the infrastructure for making this operational at the State Bar. So the focus at first was really laying the foundation for how this framework would operationalize. So one of the first things we did, we built all the tools and processes necessary. So business case summaries, project policy documents, and then we started requiring them to be submitted. And so at this point, everything goes through these templates and these processes that we've outlined. We've also established both of the committees. And like I said, we've had several meetings with those committees. We also developed the generative AI usage inventory. Since we were using some AI before the governance framework was passed, we had to bring some of that usage into compliance with what was passed in November. So we've been working hard on that. And then on the bottom, policies and communication, we've done additional training with all of our staff about the importance of human review and how to think about AI and how to engage with the governance framework. And now we have initiated fully operationalizing the framework. So this is very exciting. We have brought all of our AI use cases into compliance with the governance framework, including all the required documentation for each of those uses. And then we have 4 new projects that have emerged as potential use cases that are currently being shepherded through this process. We have hosted 4, actually now 5, I will say, generative AI review staff committee meetings, and we've had 1 generative AI oversight panel committee meeting. We've also developed the generative AI usage inventory and have shared it with you all today. We're also currently working on updating our own AI guidelines to more formally incorporate the governance framework. And we've launched additional staff-wide trainings on AI usage. And we're currently working on narrowing our list of authorized AI tools across the organization to reduce risk. And I will talk a little bit about why we're doing that later. Actually, I'll talk about it now. So our current focus areas, this is how we're really thinking about our AI portfolio right now. We are looking at creating fewer authorized generative AI systems, so fewer allowable systems, but for the ones that we are authorizing, greater investment, better compliance, and really looking at how can we make the most of what we already have, and rather than kind of having this sprawl. You all might, I talked about this at my presentation last year, but Copilot Chat is native to kind of everything we do in our Microsoft environment. And it is of no additional cost to the State Bar. And so our focus is how much can we get out of Copilot Chat and can it meet the need? So before we look to something else or look to purchase something else, our focus is really, can Copilot Chat meet the need? The other way this exists is if we have current systems that are adding AI features, that makes more sense to us in terms of not adding a new system, but adding those AI features if they make sense for the State Bar at the time. So we are looking at some for Agentforce, which runs admissions, their Salesforce platform. That's kind of going through the process right now. GitHub Copilot is where we do a lot of our coding and technical work, and that is something we have added to our portfolio. And then Zendesk is also an IT product that we have that we're looking to expand into. So that's just to say fewer systems, but greater investment and better focus on them. And then on the bottom, we are just building staff capacity. So like I said, we have done a lot of training. We have brought, a lot of communication into the state bar to talk about AI. And then we are really integrating legal and cybersecurity processes at every step of the process. As many of you know, a lot of what we are dealing with is software companies are adding AI features without really asking anybody. And so what we are doing is creating touch points where we can monitor that to make sure we're on top of knowing what's in our systems. Now I'm going to go over the list of AI tools that we are currently using. For just this report out, I'm actually going to provide you all the list of every AI tool we've ever used. So we'll also look at historic ones that we have sunset. That's just for your context. Moving forward, we'll just be presenting the ones that we are currently using. Currently, we have 6 low-risk AI tools in use and 10 medium risks. And then I do want to call out most of our medium risk tools are AI tools that our Office of Strategic Communications uses for external writing and editing. Just as a reminder, medium risk is if it goes to the public. So that is really like the Office of Strategic Communications does a lot of that. So our low risk use cases, we do have a Claude Enterprise account, which we can use for specific. There are some things Claude can do a little bit better, like actually quite a bit better than Copilot Chat. So in some limited ways, we are using Claude as an AI assistant for low use risk cases. Copilot Chat is our go-to generative AI assistant used by our staff for low risk use cases in general. And I will call out where you see an asterisk, those are the systems that are allowed to have confidential information. So those have been checked out by our cybersecurity team, our legal team, and they've reviewed those terms very closely. We also, Percipio is our learning management software. They have an AI search capability. It's not used quite often, but it is there, so it is on our inventory. Slido is also an internal facing polling tool that we use at staff meetings for engagement, and it has some AI components. Westlaw Precision is a search capability within Westlaw that we currently have that system. And then Zendesk is how we handle IT help desk tickets here at the State Bar. Zendesk has a feature where, let's say someone asks to reset a password. Zendesk can look at old tickets that have similar requests and prompt the IT staff person with, hey, here's how you've responded to this in the past. And it will just give them some points of reference in case they need to jog their memory about how to do it. This is all internal. Zendesk does not handle outside IT questions. And then I'll talk about some of these in gray a bit. So in gray,
Helen,
oh yeah,
excuse me, Helen, if
no,
I could ask you to not go through each one
oh
and to
yeah.
wrap this up, I want to leave time for questions.
Okay, sounds great. And I'll just say this, the gray really shows how we are doing all we can to sunset things that we do not need anymore. So we have canceled those. And then here with medium risk, these are mostly, like I said, strategic comms uses things for posting for social media and externally. And then you'll see at the bottom, orange, the Claude and Copilot use cases that are related to both OCTC and Crew, which I know is another agenda item. Those are on hold currently. So those are on our inventory, but noted as on hold. These are the kind of things that we have approved medium risk use cases for Copilot Chat and Claude. They're very standard administrative type tasks like email, public engagement, data encoding, and educational information. Again, here are some that we have sunset. These are pilots that we did. A lot of them are actually like legal tool focused pilots that did not pan out for us. We did not see the ROI in them, so they are no longer in use. And that is the end of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Helen. I really appreciate it. One of the things I appreciated the most is showing us how you did pilots, what you learned, and then that there's a bunch you're not using anymore. That's useful for someone like me to feel like you're doing a thorough job. So I'm going to open this up to questions from my colleagues. Yes, please, Trustee Harrison.
I'm just curious, why did the bar stop using Westlaw Code Counsel?
Yeah, Erica, I know
I
you're
can
here
jump
for
in
that.
here, and then I would invite once Aline is here, but once George is here later for another item, he can speak to this perhaps as well. So when we were using it, as you may be aware, in OCTC and many of our offices that use these products, we are really working from a relatively limited area of authorities. And that is typically decisions out of the review department of the State Bar Court and from the Supreme Court. And so what we really need is a closed system that only addresses those authorities, that is much more limited than, frankly, what some of the larger legal products offer, which are looking at every case from every district, federal, and you can certainly narrow it down, but they don't necessarily go into that very discrete level that we needed, which is why we were exploring doing it internally utilizing Copilot Chat, which again, we will talk about a little bit in the next item.
All right, thanks. That's what I suspected. And
Great, great. Good question, good response. Other questions people have? Well, while you're thinking of your questions, I have one to start out with, and it really has to do with the question of how these projects are categorized. I'm actually surprised to see so few in high risk, as in none right now. And I would suggest I would suggest a couple things. One is that the audit committee and board ought to be consulted more about what the categorization should be. Because to have nothing high risk, I think, is an issue in and of itself. I think the fact that and we'll talk about this later, but the fact that the Supreme Court put a hold on using AI to screen disciplinary cases is probably a good indication that's high risk. The risk was high enough that they put a hold on it. So I would want to make sure that that's categorized as high risk. And before we do anything, it comes back to the board. That'd be an example. The other high risk thing that comes to my mind is translation. I appreciated the earlier presentations that you made on translation. I was very impressed by it. Translation of complaints is what I'm speaking of. Complaints that come into the state bar that are written in languages other than English. Okay. But I think that's high risk. We got to get it right in terms of what people are complaining about and what their concerns are to make sure they're addressed. And so those are two examples that come to my mind. And this is a discussion item only. We're not making any decisions today. But in the interest of discussion, those are a couple of things I've been thinking about. I'd like to know, Helen, if you or any other staff person has some ideas on how we can address this question of categorization of risk.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Trustee Tony. And I do think this generative AI inventory hopefully lays out for you all of our use cases and gives you that visibility if you do want to kind of use that second part of the high risk column to move something to high risk. And I do think that was kind of the whole point of the inventory, is to provide that visibility and ability, to move that to high risk. And we would welcome that if that's what the board decides.
Can I just add?
Yeah,
Sorry.
please.
I think what you're seeing also is perhaps with the exception of utilizing Copilot in the discipline context, and that includes translation. So, what we have been kind of discussing, we have, I think, as an organization, been pretty, from my perspective, speaking obviously for myself, cautious in this space overall. And that's maybe why you haven't seen high risk use cases yet. We are exploring some opportunities, at least internally facing with agentic AI, which means that it would take action without us, without a human resolving it. And it's, not speaking from the classification standpoint, but what it would be doing is basically staff would be issuing a request for something. It would give you answers to your question in that use case, and then it would close your request. And we are exploring that because it does not include a human in the loop is something that we are looking towards presenting to the board at a future date, that does satisfy that high risk category because it is agentic. So I think you may be seeing, notwithstanding, Trustee Tony, what you described as maybe there are things that we're already doing that need to be moved into the high risk category. There are also things where we are starting to dip our toes into other areas that I think could classify as high risk. 2 years ago, or I guess 3 years ago, when we all started talking about this, like agentic AI was just like a future thought. And now it's really present. And in the same way that we're seeing AI embedded in many products, we're starting to see agentic AI embedded in many products as well. That's kind of becoming the norm. So I do think I just want to say that hearing what you're saying as to exploring how to bring more things to your attention, I think you'll also just naturally see more things coming to you in that high risk category in the coming months and years and so forth.
Thank you for that, looking over the horizon, for us. That's very useful. Other questions or comments from trustees? Okay, well, hearing none, I am going to thank you, Helen, for this presentation. Thank everybody for the conversation. And since this is a discussion item and not a decision item, I believe we can close this and move to the next agenda item. It's item 3.2, and it's a preliminary discussion again, not action, of response to the Supreme Court's January 28, 2026 letter regarding the use of generative AI in connection with disciplinary complaints. And we've got several people on the list, and I will ask you to arm wrestle among yourselves to see who goes first. And please, you can introduce yourselves as you speak. Thank you.
So thank you, Chair Tony. George Cardona, Chief Trial Counsel. I'll be going first. Joining me today on the meeting is Atlas DeMarco, who's a trial attorney in our office, who, as I think you know, has been responsible for much of our development of our AI tool that we're going to be talking about today. Also, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I also just wanted to mention so let me ask, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. So the other person who's mentioned here is Kevin Lindarto. Atlas and Kevin have been taking the lead on putting together the draft of the report that we'll be presenting to the board in May. In addition, Atlas sits on the review committee as OCT's representative as part of the generative AI framework, and Kevin sits as OCT's representative on the oversight panel. So that just gives you some background on what we're going to be talking about. So basically, this is kind of the preliminary results of what we've done in response to the Supreme Court's letter. So just as some background, if you recall, as you know, in November, the board approved the generative AI framework. In December, there was a letter that the State Bar sent to the Supreme Court about that framework and about OCTC's complaint review process in terms of using Copilot Chat and an input prompt that we had developed to conduct an initial review of complaints. We began doing that on January 5th, 2026. We started using that particular prompt that had been developed under the generative AI governance framework. It was a medium risk thing. It did involve generation of some content that might end up in a closing letter, for example. It also, more importantly, involved analysis that would be used in making decisions on those closing letters. However, it was always subject to human review. and that was mandatory. In other words, we were not allowing the AI agent to do anything on its own. It was always just basically serving as an assistant to the intake attorney who was doing the initial review. And for that reason, it was viewed as a medium risk case. As you know, then on January 28th, we got a letter from the Supreme Court telling us basically to put all this on hold until we did certain things and submitted a report to the Supreme Court. So we've been working on doing all of that and putting together that report. And what I'm basically going to go through each of the things that the Supreme Court required us to do, what we've gathered so far, and where we are. So in terms of security, they wanted us to outline the efforts to protect the confidentiality of closed complaints and investigations as required by statute. So I think, as you've heard, Copilot Chat is part of Microsoft, and so it is subject to all of the data protections that go with other Microsoft enterprise products. We use it in a closed environment so that information and documents that we upload to it are not used for training of the large language model and are not made available to anybody else. So that maintains the security. In addition, all of our communications back and forth with Copilot Chat are subject to the same enterprise data protection as our emails and our files, both of which are held on clouds maintained by Microsoft. So we've basically got the same protection for our security as we do for our emails and SharePoint files, all of which contain similar confidential information. It includes, and I'm not an expert on this, so I won't go through it, but there's multiple encryption methods, protocols, and ciphers to ensure that those communications remain secure. In addition, for Copilot Chat, in addition to being a closed enterprise environment, web search is off, so it doesn't go out and search for new information on the web. It's using a closed set of learning that it has before we start using it. There's logging of all of our prompts and responses for security, compliance, and auditing, so we can pull those down and look at them at any time. And again, the data is stored within Microsoft 365's boundaries, so it's subject to all of the security that fits with our other Microsoft uses. Bottom line, it's very secure. It's been checked by our cybersecurity people, and it's subject to contracts with Microsoft to ensure that it maintains confidentiality. So that's basically security. In terms of methodology, the Supreme Court wanted us to address the scope and methodology of our initial testing of the tool and later implementation, to process pending complaints, and what efforts we take to ensure that intake staff is actually engaging in the human review that we are requiring. In other words, that we're not just automatically doing what Copilot tells us to do without any review. So in terms of the initial testing and implementation, Atlas DeMarco was the person who primarily was involved in that. So this was done between September and November of 2025. In essence, there was a baseline set of 20 closed cases that we used for testing and development, 10 of which have been closed, 10 of which were forwarded. And as the prompt was developed and revised, those same cases were used to do testing so that we had a baseline to look across as the tool developed to see what the changes were doing and how they affected the outcomes on those cases. Then from November 25 to January 2026, the intake attorney basically would do their analysis. In other words, they were in intake, so they were assigned to do initial review of complaints. They would do that independently, and then having done that and reached their result, they would then go back and run the AI prompt to see if the AI prompt agreed with the result that the intake attorney had reached independently before running the AI prompt, so that there wasn't the potential for influence on the intake attorney's decision by what they had seen in the AI tool. After doing this, they compared, and there was basically an 85 to 90% approximate agreement rate. And you have to understand that in addition to, because Copilot Chat is a closed system, it doesn't have access to all the information that the intake attorney does. So for example, the intake attorney may also be looking at things like prior complaints that the attorney has suffered, or related complaints that the attorney has suffered, or additional information in the Odyssey file that has not been uploaded into Copilot Chat. So that 85 to 90% agreement rate is in part explainable by the fact that the tool isn't getting all of the information that the intake attorney has to make their decisions on. So just bear that in mind. We then began using the tool in January of 2026. The intake prompt 1, and I'm going to call it intake prompt 1, to differentiate it from a subsequent version of the tool that was developed later, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So intake prompt 1 was made available for all intake attorneys to use. They were given training and step-by-step instructions. We had basically a 50% use rate, which is roughly half the attorneys in intake actually started using it. The other half said, no, I don't want to use it. I think I can do it better on my own. So they weren't using it. So we, in effect, had a built-in pilot. And in fact, we met with the Supreme Court liaison sometime in mid-January, talked about it. After talking with them, we shifted over to being an intentional pilot. So we assigned approximately 50% of staff to use it, 50% not to use it, which was essentially what was already happening. And we're going to run that as a pilot going forward. So we would have comparative results. Then we got the Supreme Court's letter and we put everything on hold as of January 28th. Human review safeguards. What do we have in place to ensure that, in fact, humans are doing a review and not just doing what it does? Well, there's a number of things. First, there are certain things built into the prompt that we use, intake prompt 1. There are design safeguards to ensure that there is human review. So there's source anchoring. So every time the Copilot chat spits something out, it gives you a specific source and it quotes verbatim from the document so that it's easy for the human to check. The language that the prompt uses characterizes everything as a preliminary assessment or a suggestion, making clear that it's not a final determination and that the individual human should in fact review to make that final determination. It's designed to use narrative prose to explain in detail the connections between the facts and its preliminary assessment, again, making it easier to review. The way it's set up is it actually provides an alternative analysis. So even if it's going to recommend closure, for example, it will provide an alternative analysis explaining why there are facts that might in fact suggest reaching the opposite conclusion, so that the individual human has in place both recommendations and has to make a choice between them. There's a disclaimer at the end identifying it as draft work product, making clear that the reviewing attorney is responsible. And that's both at the start and at the end. In addition, we did extensive training and we have an internal OCTC policy that made clear that the attorney remains responsible for the content of any documentation or communication and must review it before doing anything with it. We did extensive training to emphasize that and make clear that this was not something that you could just rely on the tool. You had to engage in human review. Finally, as you saw from the generative framework, this would be subject to ongoing semi-annual reviews by the Oversight Committee. In addition, our OCTC policy requires a notice, a disclaimer on any communication externally if the work product generated by AI is either a substantial basis for or incorporated in the document. And we will be adding to our policy in response to the Supreme Court's letter, we're going to add requirements for spot checking of open cases. And we're also going to add to our random audit of closed cases questions that address use of AI going forward. So all of those together, we think will assure that there is the human review that we are relying on. So next, in terms of actual data, the Supreme Court wanted us to go back and audit the cases in which we had used AI. We have gone back and looked at the cases for which we used the intake prompt, the tool we had designed between January 5th and January 28th. I will note, just so the Audit Committee is aware, there may have been other more minor uses of AI. So for example, there may have been instances in which a person used AI to summarize a single document at some point in time prior to January 5th. There were instances we had a translation pilot that was going on a separate track. We have not gone back and looked at all of those uses because the number would be overwhelming, and it also because the uses, the non-tool uses, were what we would characterize as low risk. And the translation pilot was set up in a way such that the human was doing the translation themselves and then checking what the AI tool was doing. So we never had an instance where there was not human review by the way that pilot was set up. So we have looked for all of the things that the court wanted us to, and our preliminary results are here. Basically, there were 139 complaints for which intake attorneys, we did a survey, used generative AI. 106 were closed, 33 were forwarded. Of those 139, 119, the intake attorney used our designed intake prompt 1. Of those 119, 91 were closed, 28 forwarded. The 20 complaints, the difference between the 139 and the 119, those are instances in which intake attorneys told us that they had used an outdated version of the intake prompt or had used Copilot Chat in some other way to summarize or analyze particular documents in a way that potentially could have affected the outcome. So we looked at those as well. What we had our intake supervisors, 3 of them who oversee the intake unit. We had them independently go back and look at each of these 139 cases and make an individual determination based on their review of the Odyssey file as to whether what the intake attorney had recommended was correct or whether they disagreed with that. We also had them look at certain substantive information to see if the charges that had been set out in Odyssey were correct, because that's one of the things our AI tool does. It identifies and recommends the charges. So we looked at that. And we looked at the closing letters as well to see if the intake attorneys agreed that the closing letters accurately reflected the charges and the reasons for closure. For the 119 cases in which we used intake prompt, we also looked at the outputs of the intake prompt to see if there were any hallucinations or errors, and whether the draft summary that it generated was correct. Again, so this was a direct check on the intake prompt as opposed to looking at what the intake attorney had done. Here's the results for all 139 cases. The intake attorney and the intake supervisor agreed in total. That's the column on the far right in 90.65%. So we had a 90% agreement rate between the audit and what was originally done on the case by the intake attorney. That was slightly higher for cases that were closed. In other words, the agreement was 91% for cases that were closed, slightly lower for cases that were forwarded for investigation. So that's good. In terms of corrective actions, basically there were 29 cases that after audit, the intake supervisor agreed should have been forwarded, no corrective action necessary. 4 cases where after audit, the intake supervisor disagreed that they should have been forwarded and thought they should have been closed. Again, no corrective action is needed. They'll just be dealt with in investigation. For the cases that were closed, there were 97 cases. There were 166 cases total. 97 of those, the intake supervisor agreed, so there's no corrective action needed. Interestingly, for 3 of those cases, the intake prompt recommended that it be forwarded to investigation. The intake attorney disagreed and closed it. The intake supervisor then came back and said, no, I think it should have been forwarded. So in essence, the audit agreed with the AI tool and not with the intake attorney. For another 5, the intake prompt and the intake attorney had both recommended that it be closed, and the intake supervisor disagreed. So for all 9 of these cases, we are reopening them and taking corrective action to determine what should be done with them. The reasons for that are important. It wasn't a determination by the supervisor that there was any incorrect identification of issues or facts, or that there was a decision that was attributable to improper reliance on AI. It was just the intake supervisor disagreed with a judgment call, which is what this essentially is, the judgment call as to whether it should be closed or forwarded. So that's basically that. Here, importantly, you can see what we looked at here was the agreement rate between the intake attorney and the intake prompt in blue, and the intake supervisor and the intake prompt in orange. Most important here is over here, you can see the overall rate of agreement between the intake attorney and intake prompt was only 77%. What does that mean? That means that there were 22.69% of cases in which the intake attorney disagreed with what the Copilot chat tool was recommending, meaning there was human review. The attorneys were reviewing it, and in 23% of the cases, roughly, were disagreeing with the AI tool and taking a different action, which from our point of view strongly supports that, in fact, the human review that was being required was, in fact, going on. We then looked at a number of other questions, 3 questions to evaluate information generated by the intake prompt. Were there any identified errors? Again, the high rates are good. So basically in 95% of cases, there were not significant errors. We then looked at questions evaluating information generated by the intake attorney. Again, you can see high rates of agreement, suggesting, again, that there weren't significant error rates in what was being done.
George, this is great. If you could try to wrap up.
I will wrap up quickly. So basically, we then did the same thing, looking back at 200 cases to do historical case testing. So these were closed cases. More importantly, we upgraded. There was a change to the AI model in December of 2025, which when we looked at it, resulted in some changes in how our prompt worked. So there was a second prompt developed to address those changes. We then tested both prompts, intake prompt 1 and intake prompt 2, on samples of 100 randomly selected historical cases. And basically, you'll see the same types of agreement rates, lack of error rates. Importantly, over here on the right, the intake prompt actually identified some issues that the intake attorneys did not in several of the cases, roughly a third of the cases. And our results of agreement, again, very high. For intake prompt 2 now, the orange overall rate, 87.5% or 82%, so somewhere in that range. Again, a very high agreement rate for the new intake prompt 2. We have not looked at efficiency because we don't have the ability to do that. Once we start using this again, which hopefully we will be allowed to, we will over time try to assess what is the actual impact of this on efficiency. That is it, and I'm happy to try and address any questions, along with Atlas, who is here and can answer questions as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, George. Open up to questions from the trustees.
I've got a question.
Please, Trustee Harrison.
So George, you mentioned that there was a conversation with the liaison about this, I guess, what evolved into a pilot of 50% on both sides, and then you got the letter. I'm wondering if the letter was a surprise or if you anticipated it, or what are your thoughts?
No, the letter did come to me as a surprise because I thought we had talked and we're going to move forward with some things that the liaison had suggested in terms of converting it into a pilot so that we would have more data going forward. So I was somewhat surprised by the letter that shut us down completely. However, I've talked with them since. I understand they want to see data before they authorize us going forward, which I completely understand. And so we're pulling together a more complete set of data, which is what we've got here, to give them, to try and reassure them that there is a substantially confident rate of agreement, and two, that the human review is in fact going on and will be going on, and that we will ensure that that goes on moving forward.
All right, thanks. And I mentioned this before when we had our prior discussion about the use of AI in reviewing complaints, just the safeguard against intake attorneys solely relying on the use of AI once they become really comfortable with it, and not doing that necessary human review. But we're not there yet. We've got to check our boxes, dot our I's and cross our T's. So thank you for your work on this.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, and I think that's one of the concerns of the Supreme Court. They want to make sure that we have procedures in place to ensure that. I'm confident that we can show them what procedures we will have to ensure that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Harrison. Other trustees who may have questions for George. George, I have a quick question. I'm trying to follow as closely as I can. What's the difference between prompt 1 and prompt 2? I'm not even sure what that means.
So Atlas, you want to take that?
Sure. Thank you for the question. That is a good question. The intake prompt version 1 was originally developed towards the end of last year. As George mentioned earlier, the model of Copilot underwent a significant upgrade where it changed the type of engine that it was using, namely that it unlocked a model that has deeper analytical reasoning. And so that in part informed the decision to kind of develop prompt 2 to try and improve it. This is an iterative process, and we're going to keep making it better. As you can see on the graph on the screen, the overall agreement rate increased pretty significantly. And with version 2, we essentially traded a slight decrease in closing accuracy for a major leap forward in forwarding accuracy, which proved favorable for our overall agreement rate, which, as George said, with the second version of the prompt, um, is somewhere between 82 and 87.5%. So, in short, it's an iterative process. It's an improvement when we're talking about the agreement rate, and it's something that we're continuing to develop to improve the overall accuracy of the prompt. That being said, I think the most important metric, as I've said before, is that the prompt is providing accurate information. The agreement rate is not the most important part. The information that's provided so that the attorney can make an informed decision is what's most important. And here we see that that is overwhelmingly the case when we have an extremely high um, uh, rate of accurate information being displayed.
That's useful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Atlas. Here's my other question, partly because I do not quite understand the review process. I want to ask you, how do you, in the review process, address the issue of anchor bias? And when I say anchor bias, I'm talking about, um, the starting point, right? If the starting point is what the AI has produced, then it seems to me that any reviewer is always biased by, even if they were reviewing a human's conclusion, because that's the starting point, anchor bias. And how do you address that a reviewer is not influenced by what the AI produced so that they may, you know, err on the side of the AI instead of their own judgment?
So I'll give a
Please. Thank you.
preliminary answer. I mean, so first I want you to consider the situation in which people are in normally. So for
Thank you.
example, in my job, I rely on recommendations from other people, and I then
Yes.
evaluate those recommendations.
Yes.
To that extent, there's an inherent anchor bias,
Yes.
whatever the source of the information. So the
Yes.
question is, how do we ensure that that information that is being provided as a basis, A, is as accurate as we can get it? So how do I know that my assistant is sufficiently good that I can rely on their recommendations or know how I should treat their recommendations?
Perfect.
And that's part of the purpose of this, is to demonstrate to people, what they should be looking for in terms of questions. And the second is to make sure that we have policies and procedures in place to ensure that people understand that they have to view the Copilot output with a degree of skepticism, and that they have to form their own independent judgment because, in part, they're going to be responsible for it. And so that's what we've tried to do. And some of the things that I noted earlier, the fact that we've tried to have the Copilot chat make clear that it's wording its suggestions, et cetera, are all intended to try and limit that anchor bias, but there is no way to eliminate it completely.
Very satisfactory response. Thank you very much. Any other questions from any other trustees? Hearing none, I'm going to go ahead, and the second part of this, I believe, is the complaint review unit component of this. So if I could turn it over to you, Aline, and your staff, please.
That sounds great. And in interest of time, I'm quickly going to turn this over to Carissa, and we're going to try to keep it as brief but detailed as possible.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aline. My name's Carissa Andreessen. I'm the crew supervising attorney within the Office of General Counsel. I'm going to share my screen quickly. So similar to what George discussed, we'll be discussing the audit that the Complaint Review Unit conducted to go over its more limited use of Copilot Chat. And just to be clear, our use happened at a different point in time than OCTC's. It was all of our use was September through November of last year, which was before Copilot was rolled out to the entire state bar. So this all occurred during sort of the general testing phase of Copilot Chat within the state bar. And then George probably mentioned this, but our audit was all of disciplinary files, which are confidential. So this is just sort of presenting statistical data. So just to give a little background for those that aren't as familiar with the Complaint Review Unit, it sort of serves as the second look administrative appeal, the review of any disciplinary complaints that were closed by OCTC. Once OCTC closes a complaint, the complainant can come to the Complaint Review Unit and ask us to review that closure. So just a little background there. So OGC's use arose from one of our strategic plan goals, which was to try to find ways where we could help eliminate the backlog of crew requests. And one of those was to test various AI tools. And so that's how the idea that Copilot crew could be a use case for Copilot came about and why we were testing it. So we did during that time develop and test a crew prompt that essentially was asking Copilot to summarize various components of the closed OCTC file and provide kind of a neutral analysis on whether that closure may have been appropriate. So then following receipt of the court's letter in January, we went back and sort of re-reviewed the way that we were using Copilot to see if it was implicated by the Supreme Court's letter, whether we needed to conduct an audit and similarly report back. And so after conducting that, we determined that it was used by crew in 56 cases. In 48 of those cases, it was used analytically, so it was asked to provide an analysis of the file. And then in 8 other matters, it was used for non-analytical purposes, which included summarizing, proofreading, translation, anything short of actually analyzing and providing some sort of analysis of the file. So we determined that we would conduct an audit of those 48 cases, and a re-review. So we did a complete re-review of those 48 cases conducted by me as the supervising attorney. And so what we found after reviewing those 48 cases is none of them required a retraction or a modified disposition or any sort of further action. So we sort of determined that the dispositions of the reviewing attorney were appropriate in each of these matters. This chart's just a little breakdown of how those dispositions looked. We had 40 that resulted in a Walker letter, and what that meant is we determined that the case was appropriately closed and should remain closed, so the complainant was informed of that. In issuing these Walker letters, the complainants were not made aware of the use of AI, so there was no disclosure made. And we have, despite what policy might be in the future, if we get back to using this, we've determined that as to these 40 matters, we would not go back and sort of post-closure notify the complainants that AI was used in these matters. In 5 of the matters, we determined that a reopening recommendation to send it back to OCTC was warranted. In 2 matters, they were referred back to intake because essentially it wasn't an appropriate point in time for a crew review. And then one of the matters that we re-reviewed was actually still pending. No disposition had been reached. And so that matter's been reassigned. And so what we essentially learned by looking at all this data is that it was substantiated that there was human review in all of these cases. And that was sort of seen by the level of kind of back and forth discussion with Copilot in terms of trying to get it to focus in on specific pieces of evidence or clarify its analysis, as well as editing to any work product that it created. And then in about, I think it was 38% of the cases, the reviewing attorney actually disagreed with the co-pilot recommended disposition, and then we entered our own independent disposition. So further from the audit, it did indicate that the usage during this period was really evaluative in nature, trying to test Copilot, see what its capabilities are, and whether it would be a useful tool for crew. And then at all times, it was having independent human review really at each stage of the review process. And I note here that we found that Copilot made errors in 17% of the matters. And, factual errors is sort of a summary that's intended to cover a lot of different things. It could have been a hallucination. It could have been a factual error. It could have been sort of flawed reasoning. And we have the breakdowns of those. And so more specific details will be included in the report to the Supreme Court. And then at this point, we have obviously suspended the use of any AI in connection with crew reviews. As of November 4th of last year, we have not been using it in crew matters. It's been suspended indefinitely until further directions from the court. These results will be presented to the board jointly in a presentation with OCTC, as well as crew will have a small inset portion describing this use to the Supreme Court, but given the nature of crew's usage being very different from the way OCTC was using it, we don't have the data points that OCTC has. So ours is more of kind of a narrative disclosure and results from the re-review of each of these cases. So I tried to keep that short for you, but I am very happy to answer any questions that you have or give more details into any of these.
Thank you very much, Carissa, for the presentation. Do appreciate it. And I want to thank the Office of General Counsel for being proactive and, determining that it would be prudent to do a review, even though it wasn't specifically requested by the Supreme Court. I think this is the kind of judgment call that speaks well to our leadership. So thank you very much. I'm going to open it up to questions from trustees. Well, thank you very much. I have no further questions that I had not asked earlier. So discussion topic. We'll have a lot more to discuss as we go forward. We'll have discussions on, questions about this, what's appropriate disclosure, when and to whom, things like that. But those will be for another day. Anything else before we move on the agenda?
Just one update, Chair, if I may, very quickly. We did evaluate, you saw on the PowerPoint presentation, that with respect to the 8 crew cases that were used for non-analytical purposes, just summarization, like one sentence translation, etc., we have evaluated that and determined that we will not be doing a further audit of it based on the results of the review of the 48 cases, as well as the current staffing and resource availability within OGC. So I just wanted to make sure you're aware.
Well, thank you for that clarification. I think that sounds fine. Okay. Well, terrific. The next item is one in which we're going to have to address in closed session. And so this is item 2.1, and it's a discussion regarding the confidential cybersecurity audit and assessment. And this is going to be in closed session pursuant to the Government Code Section 11126C18 regarding matters posing a threat or a potential threat to criminal or terrorist activities against the State Bar personnel, property, equipment, including the use of electronic data. Basically, these discussions are about cybersecurity, and we want to keep those confidential. And this is interesting because Bagley-Keene actually requires a vote, a motion and vote to go into closed session for this particular reason. It's a little different than other elements of Bagley-Keene. And so, the cybersecurity audit and assessment we're going to be discussing includes some detailed information on state bar technology systems, data programs, business operations that, if disclosed, could compromise the security of the state bar electronic systems. So with that, I would entertain a motion to enter into closed session pursuant to the government code section 11126 C18. And if someone would be willing to make a motion, I'd appreciate it.
I'll make the motion.
Trustee Harrison makes the motion. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Second by Trustee Buenaventura. All right, I will ask for the roll to be called.
Buenaventura,
Aye.
Harrison,
Aye.
Huser,
Aye.
Stevens,
Aye.
Tony.
Aye.
The motion carries.
Thank you. We will be coming back to open session. And trustees, each of you should have received an email with a new link for the closed session. So for now, we're going to recess the open session, go to the closed session, and when we come back, I'll give an estimate about 30 minutes. We will then come back into open session. All right. Thank you, everybody. We're on recess.
Trustee Benedict.
Thank you. Welcome back, everybody, to the open session of the State Bar Audit Committee. We have concluded our closed session, and there's no reportable action taken. And with that, we will adjourn the Audit Committee meeting, and we will see you next time. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.